question's not related to anything you talked about. I just wondered if you would compare Yale and Vanderbilt.
They're two very different schools. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Could you say something about the way in which an old white guy can learn to be ornery in a good way on the basis of what you said?
Listen. And I say that intentionally because so much of what happens in our interactions is we don't listen to one another. We try to come up with answers and solutions because that's how we're trained. And I think old white guys got that worse than most others, although I know some other folks who have that problem. But it's the fine art of listening to hear. I think that's so important. Because like any new skill we acquire, it takes listening and watching and practice. And sometimes we dare into that and it's not a problem, but other times we feel like we can't make a mistake. And when we're living our lives, when we're trying to live into a new heaven and a new earth, we have to, I think, count on making mistakes. We just don't stay there in the mistake. We try not to, don't make that mistake over again. You might make some new mistakes. But I think that is very much a part of what James Baldwin calls doing your first works over, to constantly be reevaluating your life as a scholar, your scholarship, as a teacher, your pedagogies, and as a thinker, what you think about. And that's an incredible, I think, gift that can happen when that inquisitive side of who we are as scholars and thinkers and teachers pauses to listen and to learn. And really, if there's any guilt going on, get over it as quickly as possible, because being guilty is not helpful. It's a tool of the status quo. And to sort of try and bring all of those things together, realizing that that's what a community is about, to help one another really, really be the best we can be. So those are opening thoughts. I'm sure we're going to talk about this more over dinner. I know you.
Carrie Robinson, and then up here, Carrie.
When Dr. Emilie Towns says ask a question, you ask a question. First, I love the idea of colored orneriness. I'm thinking of this idea alongside a lot of conversation that is going on surrounding a politics of respectability. And looking at the sort of way in which a politics of respectability has been employed historically as a form of moral and political agency, over and against this idea of colored orneriness, which I sort of, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I located sort of in the tradition somewhat of critical race theorist Derek Bell, who talks about an ethics of defiance, right? That part of the movement of colored orneriness is to disrupt, right? To be defiant. But I'm wondering, how do you respond to the argument, a politics of respectability that is not only embraced by the conservative African-American establishment, but also is embraced as a sort of a theological hermeneutic by many prosperity gospel churches, as well as just, other conservative African-American churches who have very traditional concepts of hope that would be very wary of this idea of colored orneriness, which might inhibit, for them at least, the conditions toward the possibility of political and moral agency within a racist society. So if you could just speak a bit more to that, what would be your response? And one more thing, and perhaps this is a different conception of hope altogether.
Well, I tried to make it, I was trying to build a bridge to a different conception of hope throughout the whole talk. So yes, you got that, you heard that, because I don't, and we were talking about this, who was there this afternoon? Just one person? Oh, well, I thought I said, yeah, I was like, wait a minute here. This was a conversation that we actually started this afternoon with YBS and Devout, in which I said, you know, somebody asked me about being happy, and I said, I don't do happy, I do joy. For all sorts of reasons, and I think it's more biblical, for one. But the politics of respectability, I think, because I grew up with it, I think was an effective strategy for its time. It's not working today. It's just not. We're getting rolled over, rolled out, and rolled on, and it's not helping us live lives of hope in ways that are healthy or meaningful, I think. It keeps the status quo in its place, because now with that politics of respectability, people, black folk dressed up don't look that odd. We've become common. But what I'm arguing for with a colored orneriness, and I'm not sure if I went into a church I'd talk about them being ornery. I might talk about them being faithful and translate everything I just said about orneriness to faithfulness. Because that's what you do when you work with words. You just shift them in and out and listen to the, pay attention to the spaces in which you're in. I think that there would have to be a long scaffolding built, particularly in conservative black churches or conservative churches in general, to embrace any notion of ornery, because it sounds so bad. But that's what we have in our heads. So it's not a term, it was a term I would use here in a seminary setting. I've used it at Drew. I see Kate Otta out there, and Isaac. Hey. At Union, I've talked about this concept because I want to shape what's going on in theological education so that you do something different when you get out to wherever it is you're going to get out to. You have different concepts you work with when you work with people. And you have to find what's going to work with this notion of colored orneriness that is actually appropriate for that setting. It might be faithfulness. It might be love. It might be hope. But you've got to find, what I don't want to advocate for anymore is finding ways for people to survive. I want to move on not only to survival, but thriving. Because I think that's what we're supposed to do. But when we live in a culture that only wants a few folk to thrive, keeping up with the politics of respectability will assure those few folks remain few in number, I think. And I have just gone against everything my parents taught me in saying that. But they were radical in their day. This is the kind of radical I'm talking about. And radical, I mean getting at the root of change.
Just you bring right up in the front.
Thank you for your talk. It was really what I needed to hear today. So I have two things. First, you spoke of going outside of old wounds and loving ourselves. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's any way that we can live within the wounds? Or see the scars? You talked about scars as armor because many of us, mm-hmm. because of our legacies, our roots, need that protection. Mm-hmm. Do you think that those wounds or those scars can be pathways to joy at all?
That's what I was arguing for.
Okay.
Is that you don't stay in the wound. You want to keep moving. And those scars may protect you for a time, but they may not and usually don't get you into hope or joy or freedom or justice. There's a distinction I make oftentimes that wasn't my distinction, but so let me rephrase that. There is a distinction Audre Lorde makes that I think is very helpful. She makes a distinction between pain and suffering. She calls suffering unmetabolized pain. And what she's getting at is suffering, you can't really name what's wrong, but you know something is so very wrong. And for her, pain is what you can name. And if you can name it, you can address it, because it's something that you can then say, be it physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. What she's trying to do with that distinction is help us realize that suffering is not always a high art form. Now, this is me. Suffering is not a high art form of Christianity or faithfulness. It is sometimes simply suffering. And it is not going to make us better people. It is not going to teach us how to get on in the midst of all that's going on. It simply keeps us in whirlpools of misery. So that living in the folds of old wounds is an image for going around and around and around and around in a cycle of suffering. What you've got to do is create a spiral out of it. And that's what I'm arguing for. Realize that, yes, sometimes you need it, but don't stay there. Don't live there.
And one more quick thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked a lot about, I'm sure, as your experiences going through academic institutions as a student and then as a professor and an administrator, and the dressing room for mayhem and the comic skits of learning. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate those spaces? How do you, in theological institutions that are built on this heteronormative empire, anti-black, anti-migrant, anti-everything, how do you navigate and stay joyous in those spaces, or find joy and claim joy in spaces that were not made for you to find joy?
Mm-hmm. I never count on an institution to give me joy. I wish that were my original idea in Revelation, but it was my mother's, who was a college administrator. When I was getting ready to go into full-time teaching, I said, "Mom, could you give me some little tips for how to do this?" Because she'd been doing it for years. And so would my father, but my father didn't talk much about what he did. Mom, she would. And she said, she gave me 3 things. Always tell the truth, because they'll be convinced you're not telling the truth, and they'll try and figure out what you're up to. And while they're busy trying to figure out what you're up to, you can get your work done. Number 2, she was right. Number 2, academic politics is like sand pits, and they always move on you. Step lightly and lively. She was right. And number 3, put your trust in people even though they may disappoint you, hurt you, whatever you. They will also be the people who may save you. Institutions aren't built to save people. Institutions are built to survive. She's right about that, too. So I put, the hardest thing of leaving Yale was the people. It wasn't the physical building. As much as I love Marquand Chapel, this is my favorite worship space in the world. Literally. But it was hard to leave the folks here I worked with for 8 years. The building, the university, but it was the people. You know, I look out and I see Mary and I see Grace Pauls. I see all sorts of folks who made this place special to come to work to every day. Harry made this place special to come to work to every day and gave me a reason for continuing to try and live into what we could possibly be as a seminary together. That same thing has happened at Vanderbilt. It's the people. I try to never confuse the institution with the people in it, knowing that people are going to be unpredictable, unreliable, and they're also going to be wonderful, marvelous, and loving. So you take it all. I try to take it all. And with that, I'm a party girl. I love to party. Some folks can testify to that. But I think, you know, if you can't, what is it Emma Goldman said? If you can't dance at the revolution, I don't want to go. Yeah. You've gotta, for me at least, you've got to maintain a sense of humor, not take myself too seriously. Remember, I'm not always right. Oh, that's so painful. And that's why it's good to be around folk who will tell you all those things and a few others. I keep my joy because I don't want to live in despair.
One last question, Nicole.
Hello, thank you for being here. Something I took away from this lecture was the importance of allowing whoever we consider the other into our streams of consciousness as a way for our communities to grow in a more positive way. But when I reflect on the notion of scars, I know that they aren't self-inflicted, they're caused by what I consider the other. So I'm curious about what that process looks like to look past those scars that were created by the others, and what does it look like to identify allies that are for you and for your people?
Well, I think scars come both internal to what we do and external. I think it both happen. And this is going to sound a little trite, but I'll try and make it deep. Look for healthy relationships. So much of what we're tempted to do, I think, sometimes, is think any relationship is better than no relationship at all. And I'm not only talking about love, I'm talking about allies. What I think we need to look for is health. What is it as we're building relationships with others who may then become allies that helps us be healthier people? That calls us out when we need to be called out, that loves us and comforts us and goes, oh baby, I'm so sorry, when we need that too. And we often don't know what health looks like because we're so used to accepting less than. So one of the ways that I know I'm in a healthy relationship when I'm trying to build allies is if the first thing that I hear them say makes me go, ooh. I squint a little because maybe truth might be possible. The second thing I look with allies is not people who look just like me. Now, one of the reasons, and Harry, I'm going to pick on you. One of the reasons that I think Harry was such a good mentor to me was that he didn't look like me. We don't even do the same stuff. He does that old New Testament, ancient Christianity stuff. And, I'm doing social ethics and, Black Lives Matter. But what I learned from him, I couldn't have gotten from anybody else but him. And that's true for all of our allies. When they're true allies, they teach us the stuff we don't know. And when we only get around folk who look like us, act like us, sound like us, are us, we don't change, we don't grow, because all we're doing is sort of, we're spinning around like a top, not going much of anywhere. So allies are those folks that help us grow, that we understand that we're moving into health. And lo and behold, healing might step off. Those are the kinds of allies that I think are the ones that will go down with you or rise up with you when things are stepping off in creation. And sometimes they're right in front of us. And we don't want to see it or we can't see it. So we need to stop. There's this wonderful line I was recalling for someone the other day in her we do senior projects. Be glad you don't go to Vanderbilt for that very reason. We do senior projects, and they're actually wonderful things because we have students come up with a project that they might use in a ministry setting, broadly drawn. And this one student was had put together really a lectio divina for children. And actually for the adults teaching children, really. That was her ulterior motive. And she was talking about, the beauty of nature and how children see nature and whatnot. And I said, have you read The Color Purple? And she said, no, I saw the movie. And I said, no, not the movie, the book. And she said, oh, no. I said, okay, I want you to read the book now that you're almost done and you only have one class. Read The Color Purple, because there is a wonderful exchange in The Color Purple between Sug and Celie when they're looking out over a field of purple flowers. And Shug says, I think it pisses God off when we don't notice what he has put in creation. It's taking that kind of time to see the beauty that's going on all around us. And sometimes they're in the allies. Sometimes they're in allies. And sometimes they're in us. And it's hard sometimes to recognize that we might be pretty good people. Thank you all.